The following is a presentation of Apologetics Press.
One of the reasons that so many people think that the Bible has contradictions in it and that the Bible writers made mistakes is because they don't really know what a contradiction is. The law of contradiction basically states nothing can both be and not be. And the law of contradiction is applied basically to the same thing at the same time and in the same sense. The famous Greek philosopher Aristotle said years ago, the same attribute cannot at the same time belong and not belong to the same subject and in the same respect. Let me read that again just so you'll get what he's trying to say here. The same attribute cannot at the same time belong and not belong to the same subject and in the same respect. Basically, it would be like this. If I claim that the door in the back of your room, let's say the back room of your house, that it is open, and I say that that door is shut, well, that may or may not be a contradiction. But if I say that door is open and I say that door is shut at the same time, and I'm using the words open and shut in the same sense, then that would be a contradiction. Aristotle went on to say it is impossible for the same man at the same time to believe the same thing to be and not to be. If I said that Ricky Smith is rich and I said Ricky Smith is poor, are those two contradictory statements? Well, they could be contradictory, but they might not be contradictory. I could be referring to two different Ricky Smiths, could I not? Maybe I'm referring to a Ricky Smith in Alaska who works with a big oil company up there, and maybe he is very wealthy, and I may be referring to a Ricky Smith in Alabama who has chosen not to work, and he doesn't have a lot of money because of his laziness. That may be the case. Maybe we're talking about two different Ricky Smiths. You see, the first principle that we need to nail down, we're going to go over three principles. I'm going to introduce them, and then we're going to look at them more critically as we look at some various Bible passages. And the first one is, the same person, place, or thing must be under consideration when you are comparing two or more Bible passages. The second principle is this: the same time must be under consideration. Let's say if I go back to the Ricky Smith example and I say Ricky Smith is rich and Ricky Smith is poor, even if I'm talking about the same Ricky Smith, I may be referring to the same Ricky Smith at two different times. Maybe Ricky Smith was poorer when he was young, and maybe he was more wealthy. Maybe he was rich when he got older. Maybe when he was younger, he didn't have a very good work ethic. He didn't apply himself very well, and then as he got older, the Lord blessed him with various opportunities. He took those opportunities and he became much wealthier. Well, the principle of the same time must be under consideration is something that we should consider. I mean, look at me for example. If I said, what color hair do I have? You probably would say, well, blackish brown hair. If you saw me 10 years ago, you would say I had black hair or brown hair. But if someone watches this video a few years from now, they're going to see a guy with maybe some gray hair mixed in with his brown or black hair. But if they meet me and my hair, and I'm still living, and I have hair, I'm probably going to have all gray hair. So it's going to depend on what time you're talking about, whether you're talking about Eric Lyons, whether you talk about him a few years ago, now, or in the future. You see, the same time period must be under consideration. And then the third principle that we need to consider is the fact that the same sense must be in consideration, must be under consideration. If I go back to the Ricky Smith example and I say Ricky Smith is rich and Ricky Smith is poor, and we're talking about the same Ricky Smith, and we're talking about the same Ricky Smith at the same time, how could he be poor and rich at the same time? Well, he may be, as James wrote through inspiration in James 2 and verse 5, God, has He not chosen the poor of this world to be rich in faith? Notice in that passage He used the term poor and rich in different senses. And so someone can be poor and rich at the same time. Those are three principles that are very important for Bible readers and those who are studying the Bible and those critics of the Bible who are examining two or more Bible passages and seeing if they conflict or not, to look at and know these principles of interpretation. So, number one, let's expound on the first principle. The same person, place, or thing must be under consideration. Let's say that you open up your Bibles and you turn to Acts chapter 12. If you look in Acts chapter 12, you're going to see that there was a man by the name of James who was killed. And so in Acts chapter 12, you read that there was a man named James that Herod had killed. But then when you turn over to Acts chapter 15 and verse 13, you're going to see where there is a James who is still alive, and there is a James who is speaking at that time, saying, "Men and brethren, listen to me," Acts chapter 15 and verse 13. Well, how could James be dead and James be living at a later time? Well, that's a pretty elementary example. It's because we have two different men named James in these Bible passages. One, James the Apostle, the other believed to be James, the brother of Jesus. Well, let's look at one that's a little bit more complicated, or perhaps. In 2 Chronicles chapter 24 and verse 20, we read where the chronicler wrote this. He said, "Then the Spirit of God came upon Zechariah, the son of Jehoiada the priest, who later was stoned with stones in the court of the house of the Lord." Now, it has been alleged that when Jesus said in Matthew 23, when He was talking to His some of the enemies of His day, that He indicated this, or He said this to them. He said, "Therefore, indeed, I send you prophets, wise men and scribes. Some of them you will kill and crucify, and some of them you will scourge in your synagogues and persecute from city to city, that on you may come all the righteous blood shed on earth, from the blood of the righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar." Now, it is alleged that Jesus made a mistake here, because when you go back to 2 Chronicles, you read of Zechariah the son of Jehoiada. But when you look at what Jesus said there in Matthew 23, He refers to Zechariah, son of Berechiah. Well, how could both the writer of Chronicles and Jesus be correct in what they said? Well, is it possible that you have two different people under consideration here? I submit to you that it could be that Jesus was referring to Zechariah, the minor prophet, who preached during the days of Ezra, Ezra chapter 5, verse 1, approximately 400 years after Zechariah, son of Jehoiada. Now, I read a statement one time by a skeptic who said the Old Testament never refers to a Zechariah, son of Berechiah. But the fact is, this Zechariah, the minor prophet, it just so happens that in Zechariah chapter 1, verse 1, he is called the son of Berechiah. And so it is very possible that even though the death of that prophet, the minor prophet, it was not recorded for us, it could very well be that this is the one that Jesus was referring to. You might say, well, how could Jesus be referring to that Zechariah if it's not recorded in the Old Testament? Well, it's a pretty simple elementary answer, and that is that Jesus being the Son of God, Jesus having knowledge, Jesus existing during the time of that Zechariah, before that time, He's always existed. He could have, had He wanted to, know that, and surely He did know that. Furthermore, it could very well be that it was also known through Jewish tradition. So it could very well be that Zechariah there, the one that Jesus was referring to, was actually the minor prophet, Zechariah 1 and verse 1. But you know what? There's also another possibility. You remember one of the principles we looked at in our last class is that any possible answer should suffice. The skeptic who says, well, that is a mistake. Well, wait a minute. How do you know that's a mistake? It could very well be, could it not? Isn't it possible that Jesus was referring to a different Zechariah? Well, it's also possible that Jesus was referring to a Zechariah from the first centuries whom the Pharisees killed. Consider, again, Matthew chapter 23. Matthew 23, verses 34 and 35. I want to read this for us again. Jesus again said, referring to the enemies there of His day, He said, "Therefore indeed I send you prophets, wise men and scribes. Some of them you will kill and crucify, and some of them you will scourge in your synagogues and persecute from city to city, that on you may come all the righteous." Now notice, on you may come all the righteous blood shed on the earth, from the blood of the righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. Now, isn't it possible that Jesus was referring to a Zechariah that was living or that had been living up until the point that they murdered him there in the first century sometime? Well, that's very possible. You may say, well, Eric, that's a lot of Zechariahs. Did you know there are a few dozen Zechariahs mentioned in Scripture? In fact, more, if I remember correctly, more than 25 Zechariahs mentioned in the Bible, maybe even closer to 30. So there could be different Zechariahs referred to. Let me give you another example of needing to make sure we apply the same person, place, or thing principle. When people read Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, I mentioned this at the beginning of our last class, and I want to expound on this for just a moment. When you look in Matthew chapter 5, you read that Jesus, chapter 5, verse 1, you read that Jesus went up on a mountain, and when He was seated, His disciples came to Him. Notice the text says, Jesus went up on a mountain. Well, when you compare that to Luke chapter 6, verse 17, where many of the same things that Jesus taught in the Sermon on the Mount are recorded by Luke in Luke chapter 6, you read that the passage says, Jesus came down with them and stood on a level place. Some translations say a plain, but the best translation is a level place. I'm reading there from the New King James Version. So you have in one text, He's on a mountain, in another text, He's on a level place. Well, how could He be preaching this same lesson at the same time on a mountain and on a level place? Is there a possible solution? Well, there certainly is a possible solution. There are a few possible solutions, and one of those is this, that He was on a level place, on a mountain, at the same time. Have you ever been on a high level and it be level before? Be, like a plane, if you will? My family and I were just in Anchorage, Alaska recently, and we hiked up a mountain called Flat Top Mountain. You can see it when you're down in Anchorage and you have an opportunity. If you ever have an opportunity to go there, it's a really neat place. Well, it's kind of a tough hike, but you can make it up that mountain perhaps. And when you get up to the top, what you will see is it is flat. You could probably play a football game, it's so flat, there on Flat Top Mountain. So you have the same time perhaps, maybe using the words in the same sense, but you have two different words that could be applied to the same place. Because you can have a flat place, if you will, on a mountain. But you know what's also possible? As we transition here into the second principle, that you have the fact that Jesus' statements here and Jesus' teachings were done and stated at two different times. Could it be, Jesus was the master teacher, was He not? Could it be that Jesus taught some of the same things on a mountain that He would have taught at a different time on a level place? Have you ever known a preacher, or have you ever known a teacher to teach the same lesson in different places? Well, of course you have. I imagine that your preacher, or some of the preachers that you've heard before, some of the teachers that you've heard, you've heard that lesson probably more than one time. And so you can have the same lesson being taught in different places. In fact, I would think it would be a shame if people up in Samaria, or down in Samaria, as you're thinking, even though it's north from Jerusalem, that they would wanted to hear many of the same things that Jesus would have taught up in Jerusalem. And so it's very possible that Jesus spoke the same lesson or many of the same things in two different places. So the same time must be under consideration. Think of a couple of Bible passages that are sometime, and this would be an elementary example, but you remember at creation, after creating everything, that God said that He made everything and indeed it was very good. You remember that? He said, indeed it was very good. But then you read just a few chapters later in Genesis chapter 6 that the wickedness of man was great in the earth and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. So how could everything be good and then everything be only evil continually? Well, you have different times under consideration. Those who've done much Bible study know very well that there is a lot of time that has passed between Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 6, several hundred years. So you have a different time. The same person, place, or thing must be under consideration. The same time must be under consideration. Let me go over one of probably the most commonly accused mistakes in the Bible. Probably the alleged contradiction that I have heard more than any other alleged contradiction, and it revolves around the apostle who betrayed Jesus. You recall Judas. And you recall how Judas is said in Matthew chapter 27 and verse 5, that he went and threw down the pieces of silver in the temple and departed and went and hanged himself in Matthew chapter 27 and verse 5. So, what did Judas do? Well, he threw the money down that he had received for betraying Jesus. He threw the money down at the priest, and he then went and hanged himself. But when you look at what Luke wrote in Acts chapter 1 verse 18, you see that Luke wrote this. Now this man Judas purchased a field with the wages of iniquity, and falling headlong, he burst open in the middle, and all his entrails gushed out. I know that's not a very pleasant scene to think about your entrails, your guts coming out of you. But it has been alleged for many, many years that what Matthew wrote and what Luke wrote in the book of Acts, that those are contradictory statements. How could Matthew say that he went out and hanged himself, and Luke say that he fell headlong, burst open in the middle, and all his guts came out? Well, thinking about the principle that we're addressing at this moment, the same time period must be under consideration. You see, sometimes the time periods under consideration, that they're separated by hundreds of years. And so it's very obvious that what Moses wrote in Genesis chapter 1 about creation and God seeing everything and it was very good, and what he wrote about what was going on at the flood and the attitude and the thoughts of people and being evil continually, well, that was hundreds of years later. So that's a fairly easy one to understand. But what about Judas? Is this not the same time, or is it just a contradiction, or what is it exactly? Well, it is, generally speaking, talking about the same thing, but specifically speaking, it is not the exact same time. I mean, the question is, could what you read in Matthew chapter 27, could that statement be true and the statement in Acts chapter 1 both be true? Well, they can both be true. You can think of a lot of different scenarios of people saying something, and you could say that, well, I saw my friend, he played in a soccer game and he got hurt. And then you could say, you could be referring later to, well, my friend, he was getting bandaged up there on the sideline after his injury. Well, you're talking about maybe generally the same thing, the injury that he suffered, but you're not talking about the exact same time. One is when the injury actually occurred. One is when he is getting attended to, perhaps by a nurse or a very caring mother. So what we have here in Matthew chapter 27 and Acts chapter 1 are two different times, even though they're very close together. You have Judas going out and hanging himself. And then what does Luke write? Well, he writes that he fell headlong. And when his body hit the ground, it burst open. So that was at a later time. Exactly how long later, we don't know. How much time expired there? Was it less than 24 hours? Was it a few days? I don't know. The text does not tell us. But the fact of the matter is, it is possible. It is rational, in fact, that if someone is hanging on a tree and he has been there, let's say, for a few days, that his body is going to bloat, it's going to increase in size. There are going to be some processes going on in his body that are not very pleasant to talk about. And then if a branch breaks, if someone cuts the rope and his body hits the ground, you may not want to envision that, but it can explode. I was reading a story one time about a whale, a mammal. We're classified as mammals. We're humans. We're much different than animals, but I read a story where a whale, a big mammal, beached itself up on a beach on the island of Taiwan somewhere. And there were some researchers at a university that decided they wanted to take this whale, they wanted to put it on the back of a truck, a big truck, and they wanted to take it to the university to study it for a while. So they had what maybe they thought at the moment was a bright idea, and so they had a crane or something and put it on the back of a truck. They began transporting it through neighborhoods in a downtown area, and it exploded. It burst open. Because when mammals die, they begin to expand, if you will, and it doesn't take much for their bodies to explode. Well, that may be a lot more than what you wanted to know about some of the processes that go on after a mammal dies, but the fact of the matter is, it's very possible for both Matthew 27 and Acts chapter 1 to be correct. Let me give you another example of an alleged discrepancy that was proposed to me a few years ago by someone who was very bothered by what you read in 1 Samuel 16 and 17, where David is indicated as being the youngest of 8 sons. 1 Samuel 16 verse 11, 1 Samuel 17 verse 12. Why is it In those two chapters, David is said to be the youngest of 8 sons. But when you read in 1 Chronicles chapter 2, verses 13 through 15, you read that Jesse begot several sons, and then David is listed as the 7th son. The last son there listed, and listed as the 7th son. I was emailed about this several years ago, and someone was saying, well, Eric, how can both of these things be true? You know what I've realized in looking at a lot of Bible passages? Is if we will consider how in modern times when we talk to each other about things, how our statements can very easily both be true, and we rarely think of each other as lying or trying to deceive each other. If you think of just modern day examples, what these Bible passages made me think of was my dad. My dad is one of the greatest people I know. He's one of my heroes, and my dad is the oldest of 8 kids. Well, is he really the oldest of 8 kids, or is he the oldest of 7 kids? Because when I was growing up and I would ask my dad to tell me about his brothers and sisters and what it was like growing up in southwest Missouri, well, he would talk about Uncle Chester and Uncle Dave and Aunt Tammy and all his other brothers and sisters. Sorry if I didn't mention all of you aunts and uncles out there, but he would talk about them, but he would talk usually about 6 of his brothers and sisters and not the 7th one. Well, why would he do that? Did he not like one of them? Was he lying about something? Well, not at all. The fact of the matter is, and it was a sad thing for my dad's family to endure, but when my dad was about 20 years old, already living away from home, he had a 5-year-old brother who was on the back of a pickup truck that was driving down the road, and he fell off and he injured himself so severely that he died. Well, this was my dad's brother. Loved him very much, but my dad's brother, Gail, he never reached adulthood. He never went to school other than maybe just a primary class or 2. He never got married. He never had children. I never knew him. And so there would be situations where sometimes my dad would talk about his 6 brothers and sisters, not because he denied the other one, but because he didn't want to have to get into a conversation about his brother who passed away every time he had a conversation about his family. So people in modern times understand how a person could say, I'm the oldest or youngest of 7, or I'm the oldest or youngest of 8, and we can understand each other, appreciate each other, respect each other, and why we would say those things. Well, is it not possible that the Bible writers did the same thing? I mean, think about it. David, if he was the youngest of 8 sons and the youngest of 7 sons, and by the way, these accounts would have been written a few hundred years apart from each other. If that is the case, is it not possible that one of the writers was referring to David being the youngest of this many sons and the youngest of that many sons because at some point in time, one of his brothers died? Of course, they would have all died at some point in time, but maybe one of them died earlier than others. And so perhaps he never got married, perhaps he never had a family, and perhaps he was not as well known as the others. In fact, one thing we know about David's brothers is that at least some of them were involved in war. You recall when David went to go meet up with Saul and the Israelite army to battle the Philistines, that his brothers were already there, at least 3 of them. So the same person, place, or thing must be under consideration. It must be at the same time, and then finally, we must be looking at these things in the same sense. Let's go back to the one in Matthew chapter 23 for just a moment. Matthew 23, 34 through 35. Again, you recall that Jesus was referring to Zechariah, son of Berechiah. However, the alleged sister passage, and it may or may not be, 2 Chronicles chapter 24, verses 20 and 21, you read of Zechariah, son of Jehoiada. Now, one says Zechariah, son of Jehoiada, one says Zechariah, son of Berechiah. Is this a mistake? Or could it be, even if the same person, place, or thing are talked about at the same time, maybe we're using the term son in different senses? You know, the word son is used in Scripture in a variety of ways. You see, it's easy to pull out a Bible passage and to say, well, this is what that Bible passage means. Instead of considering, as we've already talked about, who was talking, looking at the context, and considering that any possible solution should suffice if it is a genuine possibility. Well, is it not possible that Jesus used the word son here, and that the word son is used in these 2 passages in different ways? I mean, think about it. Samuel is called the son of Eli in 1 Samuel chapter 3 and verse 6. Was Samuel the actual son of Eli, or is that used in a different sense than the way we normally use it? You recall that David is called the son of Saul, but was David the son of Saul? No, he was the son-in-law of Saul. You recall that he married one of Saul's daughters. The word son is used just to mean descendant. In Matthew chapter 1, verse 1, you read that Jesus was the son of David, the son of Abraham. Was he, a direct descendant? I mean, just like father, son? Or is the word son there used to mean really descendant? And then you have the word son that is used to mean grandson. You know that Jonathan had a son named Mephibosheth, and that is the son of Jonathan, but there are times where he's called the son of Saul, when it means the grandson of Saul. So it could be that we have a son and a grandson being mentioned here. In fact, if you look at Zechariah 1:1, we looked at this passage earlier, we see that there is a minor prophet here, and he is called, remember, he is called the son of Berechiah. Next to the last book in the Old Testament, Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, the son of Iddo. But when you compare this to Ezra chapter 5 and verse 1, he's called Zechariah, the son of Iddo. But what you realize when you compare another passage is, well, he's actually the grandson of Iddo, and he is the son of Berechiah. So we need to make sure that we're talking about the same person, place, or thing at the same time and in the same sense. The same sense. Now, think again at Judas and the money that was used, that Judas received for betraying Christ and that he threw down before he went to go out and hang himself. Notice what Matthew 27 says about that money. Matthew 27, verses 6 and 7, we read that the chief priests took the silver pieces, consulted together, and bought with them the potter's field to bury strangers in. Okay, so who took the money? Well, the chief priests took it, and they consulted together and they bought the potter's field. But when you compare that with Acts chapter 1 and verse 18, you read, now this man Judas purchased a field with the wages of iniquity. Wait a minute. The chief priest purchased the field. Judas purchased the field. How could Judas purchase the field if he was already dead? Well, think about how these words purchased could be used in a different sense. I mean, I suppose technically the ones who purchased the field were the chief priests. But in a sense, could you not also say that Judas purchased that field? It was the money that Judas had that he threw down that was used to purchase the field. I remember my first car, if I remember correctly, it's been a few years ago now. I'm not 16 nor anywhere close to 16 these days, but the first car I got, if I remember correctly, I saved up some money and my dad saved up some money. So we kind of went hand in hand, and my mom and dad, they blessed me with a $1,900 Ford Escort. But let's say we're not talking about a Ford Escort. Let's say you're talking about some other car, and I didn't contribute anything to it. So my dad, let's say that he said, here is $1,900. You can go and buy a car. Now, I don't know if it's very wise for a dad just to hand over $2,000 nearly to a son and say, go buy your own car. Probably need a lot of instruction there, but let's say he did that. And I went down and the transaction was made and I gave $1,900 to the car dealership. Who bought the car? Well, I could go over to my friend's house and said, listen, I bought this car today for $1,900 down at the Ford dealership. But I might also say, my dad and mom bought this car for me. You mean I could say two different things and be correct in both of them? Yes, because I'm using those words in different senses. You know, the Bible oftentimes talks about people doing something through other people. When Joseph revealed himself to his brothers, you recall in Genesis chapter 45, he revealed himself and he said, I'm Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into Egypt. Now, he did wind up in Egypt, but Joseph's brothers did not directly sell him into Egypt. They sold him to the Ishmaelites, also known as the Midianites, who then took him down to Egypt. So, the Bible speaks of, in fact, even Stephen's speech in Acts chapter 7 and verse 9, he speaks of Joseph being sold by his brothers into Egypt. Well, he was actually sold into Egypt by the Ishmaelites or the Midianites who bought him from the brothers. But we oftentimes talk about in modern times, we see in Scripture how that figure of speech, if you will, is used in that way, and words are used in different senses. In John chapter 4, verses 1 and 2, you read that Jesus baptized disciples, or baptized those who became His followers. But then you see in the very next verse, in verse 2, that actually Jesus did not baptize, but His disciples did. Well, how could Jesus baptize and not baptize at the same time? Well, the obvious answer to that when you look at John chapter 4 is it was the teachings of Christ that led people to become immersed in water. And yet, He didn't do the baptizing, His disciples did. We're not told exactly why. We could come up with various possibilities as to why. Maybe what we see over in 1 Corinthians chapter 1 where people were being divided over, well, who baptized them? Maybe people would put more emphasis on who baptized them instead of why they were being baptized into Jesus Christ. And so we need to realize that, and pay attention to the principle that pretty much everyone knows and understands, that when they read their Bible, at least some people, they do not give the Bible writers the option of using this principle, and it is this, that he who acts through another is deemed in law to do it himself. You see, you could go out here and commit a great act, and you could give someone some money, and they could go out and buy something for themselves that they need, and they could say they bought it, and they could also say that so-and-so bought it for me. You could also go out here and you could commit a tragedy. You could go out here and murder someone, or you could pay someone to murder someone. That would be a terrible thing. But you know, if you didn't murder someone, but you paid someone to murder someone, could you ever be convicted of murder? You certainly could. You see, when we study the Bible, we need to be fair with what the Bible writers said, what they wrote. We need to consider the important principles that the same person, place, or thing must be under consideration. When we are comparing two Bible passages or more, we need to realize, ask ourselves, are we talking about the same time? And are we looking at these words, and are they used in the same sense?
This has been a presentation of Apologetics Press, an organization dedicated to the defense of New Testament Christianity. Visit us on the web at apologeticspress.org or call 800-234-8558.